The sun was setting over the Oklahoma prairie when Thomas heard the cry. It came thin and desperate across the wind-swept grassland, and for a moment he thought it might be a coyote or perhaps just the wind playing tricks on an old man's ears. But then it came again. Please. The word carried pain and fear in equal measure. Thomas set down the bucket of feed he'd been carrying to the barn and listened. He was 62 years old and had spent the last 30 of those years alone on this ranch after Mary passed. The days had a rhythm to them that he'd come to appreciate, and unexpected visitors were rare. Help me. There it was again. Thomas walked toward the sound, and his boots crunching on the dry earth and his heart beating a little faster than usual. Beyond the fence line near the old cottonwood tree he saw her. A young woman, and maybe 30 years old, and lying on the ground with her hands bound behind her back with rough rope. Her face was bruised and swollen and her clothes torn and dusty. Blood had dried on her forehead and arms. When she saw him approaching, she tried to push herself up and failed and collapsed back onto the hard ground. Please help me, she sobbed, and her voice breaking with exhaustion and terror. Thomas climbed over the fence and moved as quickly as his aging knees would allow. He knelt beside her, and his weathered hands gentle as he examined the ropes. You're safe now, he said quietly, and his voice steady and calm. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. She flinched when he touched the rope, and her eyes wild with fear. It's all right, Thomas continued, and speaking slowly and keeping his voice low and reassuring. I'm just going to cut these ropes and then we'll get you inside and cleaned up. He pulled his pocketknife from his jeans and carefully cut through the bindings. The rope had cut into her wrists and leaving angry red marks that made his jaw tighten with anger. But he kept his voice gentle. Can you stand? She shook her head and tears streaming down her face. Without hesitation, Thomas scooped her up, and surprised by how light she was and how fragile she felt in his arms. She was trembling, and whether from fear or shock or cold he couldn't tell. He carried her across the field and through the gate and up the porch steps of his modest ranch house. Inside he laid her carefully on the old sofa that Mary had picked out decades ago. The house was simple and clean but sparse. A widower's home. Thomas brought a basin of warm water and clean cloths and a first aid kit he kept under the kitchen sink. My name's Thomas, he said as he began to gently clean the blood from her face. Thomas Brennan, and I've lived on this land most of my life. She watched him with fearful eyes but didn't pull away as he worked. What's your name? Sarah, she whispered. Her voice was hoarse and raw from crying. Sarah Mitchell. Well, Sarah, and you're safe here, and I promise you that. He cleaned her wounds with careful patience and the way he once cared for injured animals and his own children years ago. The bruises on her face were severe and her eyes swollen nearly shut. Rope burns circled her wrists. But there was something else in her expression beyond the physical pain. A deeper wound that came from betrayal and cruelty. Who did this to you? Thomas asked quietly as he applied antiseptic to a cut above her eyebrow. Sarah's lip trembled. My husband, she said in her voice barely audible. And his brother. Thomas's hands stilled for just a moment. He'd seen enough in his years to know that evil often wore familiar faces. They said I was worthless, Sarah continued, and the words tumbling out now as if a dam had broken. Said I couldn't do anything right and that I deserved every bit of pain they gave me, and they tied me up and drove me out here into the middle of nowhere and left me to die. She sobbed, and her whole body shaking. They said I was the devil's kin and that I wasn't fit to live among decent people. Thomas set down the cloth and looked at her with eyes that had seen their share of sorrow. Sarah, he said in his voice firm but kind. Those men are the ones who aren't fit to live among decent people, and what they said about you isn't true and not a word of it. He went to the kitchen and poured her a glass of water and brought her one of Mary's old quilts to wrap around her shoulders. You drink this and rest, and we'll figure out what to do next. As Sarah sipped the water and pulled the quilt close, and Thomas went to the phone. He called Sheriff Morton, and a man he'd known for 40 years, and explained the situation in his typical quiet and straightforward manner. Then he made chicken soup and the recipe Mary had taught him, and the one comfort he'd learned to make well in his years alone. The kitchen filled with the warm smell of broth and vegetables and herbs. When he brought Sarah a bowl, she looked at him with confusion. Why are you being so kind to me? She asked. You don't even know me. Thomas settled into the chair across from her and his own bowl of soup in hand. My Mary used to say that kindness doesn't need a reason, he replied. It just needs to be given, and when my son Daniel was going through his troubles with drinking and Mary never turned him away, and not once, and she said family isn't just blood and it's anyone who needs help when they're hurting. He paused and looking out the window at the darkening sky. Daniel's been sober 15 years now and he's got a family of his own, and sometimes I think about how different things might have been if Mary hadn't shown him that kindness when everyone else had given up. Sarah ate slowly, and the warmth of the soup and the safety of the house gradually calming her. Thomas didn't press her with questions. He simply sat with her in his presence, quiet and steady. Sheriff Morton arrived an hour later, and a stocky man with gray hair and a gentle demeanor that belied his authority. He took Sarah's statement carefully, and his anger growing as she described what her husband and brother-in-law had done. "We'll find them," he promised. "And they'll answer for this." After the sheriff left and Thomas set up the guest room and the one that had belonged to his daughter Catherine before she moved to Denver. He found clean clothes that had belonged to Mary and soft flannel pajamas and a warm robe. "You can stay here as long as you need," he told Sarah. "No rush and no expectations, and you just heal." That night, as Thomas lay in his own bed and he thought about the strange turn his quiet life had taken. He'd been content in his solitude and found peace in the rhythm of ranch work and the company of his horses and cattle. But there was something about Sarah's arrival and something about the chance to help someone in desperate need, and that stirred something in him he thought had died with Mary. A sense of purpose beyond just getting through each day. The next morning Sarah emerged from the guest room looking small in Mary's old clothes. Thomas was already up and making breakfast, and eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits. "I hope you don't mind," she said hesitantly. "I heard you moving around and couldn't sleep anymore." "Mind? Of course not, and this is your home now for as long as you need it." They ate together in comfortable silence and the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows. After breakfast Thomas showed her around the ranch and introducing her to the horses and explaining his daily routine. "I don't expect you to work," he said quickly. "You need time to heal." But Sarah shook her head. "I'd like to help, and if that's all right, and I need to do something with my hands and something to keep my mind occupied." So Thomas showed her how to feed the chickens and collect eggs and how to groom the horses. He was patient with his instructions and never raising his voice, and always encouraging. Sarah found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in years. There were no angry outbursts here, and no cruel words, and no violence waiting around every corner. Just a kind old man who asked nothing of her except that she take care of herself. The days turned into weeks. Sheriff Morton called regularly with updates. Sarah's husband and brother-in-law had been found and arrested and charged with attempted murder and assault. A restraining order was in place. Sarah would need to testify eventually, but for now she was safe. As autumn deepened and the prairie grass turned golden, and Sarah found herself settling into the rhythm of ranch life. She learned to mend fences and help with the cattle and even cook some of Thomas's favorite meals. In the evenings they would sit on the porch and watching the sunset and talking about life. Thomas told her about Mary and how they'd met at a county fair when they were both 17. How they'd built this ranch together from nothing. How they'd raised 2 children and weathered droughts and hard times and good times too. He spoke of Mary's death from cancer and how the grief had nearly broken him. "But I learned something in those dark days," he said one evening as the sky blazed orange and pink. "I learned that pain doesn't last forever, and that healing comes slowly and sometimes in the smallest moments, and a good cup of coffee and a horse nuzzling your hand and the sound of rain on the roof." Sarah listened, and her own wounds slowly healing. "My whole life I thought I wasn't worth anything," she admitted. "My parents told me I was difficult, and my husband told me I was stupid and useless, and I started to believe it." Thomas looked at her with fierce kindness in his eyes. "Sarah, and those people were wrong and dead wrong, and you're strong and capable and good, and I've seen it every day since you've been here." Tears streamed down her face. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you just keep being kind when the world is so cruel?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Because somebody has to be," he finally said. "And because kindness is the only thing that really lasts and long after we're gone, and the kindness we showed and the help we gave, and that's what people remember, and that's what makes the world a little bit better." Winter came to the prairie. Sarah had been with Thomas for 3 months. She'd testified at the trial, and her husband and brother-in-law were sentenced to prison. The ranch had become her refuge and her healing place. One cold December evening, as they sat by the fireplace and Thomas reading his newspaper and Sarah working on a quilt, and she broke the silence. I've been thinking about what comes next, she said. Thomas looked up and his expression neutral. I want to stay, Sarah continued. If you'll have me in not as a guest but as help, and I could work the ranch with you and earn my keep, and I've learned so much and I want to learn more. Thomas set down his paper. Sarah, and you don't need to earn anything, and you're welcome here for as long as you want, and not as hired help but as family. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Sarah had never really known what that word meant, and not in its truest sense. But here in this simple ranch house with this kind old man who had asked nothing of her except that she believe in her own worth, and she finally understood. Family, she repeated softly. Yes, and I'd like that very much. Thomas smiled, and the deep lines around his eyes crinkling. Then it's settled. That Christmas was the first joyful one Sarah could remember. Thomas's son Daniel and daughter Catherine came to visit with their families. They welcomed Sarah warmly, and Daniel especially seemed to understand what his father had done for her. Dad has a gift for seeing people's potential, Daniel told Sarah as they washed dishes together. When I was at my lowest and drowning in addiction, and he never gave up on me, and he showed me that I was worth saving, and looks like he's done the same for you. Catherine hugged Sarah before leaving. Thank you for being here for Dad, she whispered. He's been alone too long, and I think you need each other. As winter gave way to spring and the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, and Sarah found herself transformed. The bruises had long since faded. The physical wounds had healed. But more importantly, in the wounds inside, and the ones carved by years of cruelty, and had begun to heal too. She was stronger now and confident in ways she'd never been. She managed the horses with skill and helped Thomas with business decisions, and even started selling eggs and preserves at the local farmer's market. But the greatest change was in how she saw herself. She was no longer the broken woman who'd been left to die. She was Sarah Mitchell, and rancher and friend and family. One evening in May, and as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and Sarah turned to Thomas. I've been thinking about what you said, and about kindness being what lasts. Yes, I want to do more, she said. There are other people out there like I was, and trapped and afraid and thinking they're worthless, and I want to help them. Thomas nodded slowly. That sounds like a fine idea. Together they began working with the local women's shelter. Sarah shared her story and offered hope to those who thought there was none. The ranch became a place of refuge for women leaving dangerous situations, and a place where they could find peace and learn skills, and most importantly, and believe in themselves again. Thomas watched it all with quiet pride. Years passed. Thomas grew older, and his steps slower and his hands less steady. But his kindness never wavered. Sarah cared for him as he had once cared for her, and with the same gentle patience and the same unwavering dedication. On a warm summer evening when Thomas was 75 and he sat on the porch with Sarah and watching the sun set over the prairie he'd called home his entire life. You know, he said, and his voice soft. When Mary died and I thought my purpose was finished, and I thought I'd just live out my days alone and waiting. He reached over and patted Sarah's hand. But you showed me that life always has more to give, and that there's always someone who needs help, and always another sunset to see with someone you care about. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. You saved my life, she said. Not just that day when you found me, but every day since, and you showed me what it means to be human and to be kind and to be worth something. Thomas shook his head. No, Sarah, and you saved yourself, and I just gave you a safe place to do it. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sky blazed with color. In the distance, new residents were arriving at what Sarah now called Hope Ranch, and women who needed refuge, and women who needed to learn that they were worth saving. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, and golden and peaceful and timeless. And in that moment, Thomas understood what Mary had always known. That kindness ripples outward in ways we can never fully measure. That one act of compassion can change a life. And that sometimes the greatest purpose we can serve is simply to see someone else's worth when they cannot see it themselves. The sun dipped below the horizon and painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Thomas closed his eyes and smiled. He had lived a good life. He had loved well and lost well, and found purpose again when he thought there was none left, and he had learned that sometimes the people we save and end up saving us right back. As darkness settled over the prairie and the lights of Hope Ranch glowed warm in the distance, and Sarah sat beside the man who had become her father and her friend and her teacher, and she knew that she would carry his kindness forward, that she would be for others what he had been for her, a light in the darkness, a steady hand when the world felt cruel, a reminder that goodness still exists, that people are worth saving, and that kindness, and simple and quiet and unwavering kindness, is the most powerful force in the world.